the false image of the North. A hall of rough-hewn timber flickers under torchlight. The smell of roasted meat, honeyed mead, and damp wool fills the air. Warriors with braided beards and inked skins slam their cups together. Women with bright woven shawls sit by the hearth, spinning threads that glitter in the shifting light. This is the image we've been given, the romantic vision of the Vikings, fearless raiders, seafaring heroes, wild and noble in equal measure. But what happens when the smoke clears and the songs fall silent? Behind the clang of swords and the crash of oars, another world existed, quieter, darker, infinitely more intimate. A world not of conquest but of bodies, of rules about who could touch whom and how. A world where desire was not private but political, where love could elevate a woman to power or destroy a man's honour in a single breath. Hollywood history books, even school lessons, have given us a myth the Viking as a simple barbarian all brawn and blood. Yet the truth is far stranger and far more revealing. Their society between the late 8th and mid-11th centuries, roughly from 793 to 766, was one of the most sexually complex of the medieval world. While Christian Europe was building cathedrals to shame the flesh, the Norse were writing sagas that revelled in it. In the dim glow of those long winters, they developed ideas about pleasure, gender, and marriage that make modern eyes widen, not only because of their freedom, but because of their contradictions. They worshipped gods who could change sex, praised women who could command armies, yet punished men who dared to show softness. Their codes were at once progressive and brutal, permissive and punitive. And what we know of them, what little the surviving sagas and laws allow us to glimpse, has been filtered through centuries of embarrassment. For generations, Scandinavian scholars preferred to highlight Viking craftsmanship, their poetry, their exploration, and quietly bury the more uncomfortable truths about how they lived, loved, and ruled their households. The Christian chroniclers who first wrote about them exaggerated their savagery. Later historians, ashamed cleaned it up. What vanished in the process was the human heart of that civilization, its desires, its hypocrisies, its tender and violent rhythms. This is the part of the story rarely told, not in textbooks, not in museum displays. Yet it's the key to understanding who the Vikings truly were, because to know what a society fears and forbids is to glimpse its soul. So tonight, as we step into their halls again, we will not look for heroes. We will listen for whispers, the unspoken rules that govern their bedrooms, their marriages, their magic. We will uncover the codes that decided who could be a man, what it meant to be a woman, and why the line between the two was more fragile than we imagine. The Viking Age, from the first recorded raid at Lindisfarne in 793 to the defeat at Stamford Bridge in 1066, spanned nearly 3 centuries. It was an age of expansion and contact when Norse ships reached from the icy fjords of Norway to the warm markets of Baghdad, from the rivers of Russia to the coasts of North America. Wherever they went, they carried not only steel and ambition, but a social order rooted in a different understanding of desire. In their world, sex was not sin. It was status. It could sanctify or destroy, elevate or enslave. To modern eyes, their customs can seem alien, even cruel, but they followed their own logic, one that reflected both the freedom and the fragility of life in the North. And so, before we can understand the strange laws of Viking masculinity or the unexpected independence of Viking women, we must first strip away the fantasy, the horned helmets, the movie thunder, and face the truth. The North was not just a land of warriors, it was a land of negotiated bodies of power expressed in flesh. This is the side of history that was not carved on stone but lived in silence. The real saga begins here. Beyond raid and sword, the social order of desire. To understand Viking sexuality, we must first understand its architecture of power. The North was not a place of equals. Every relationship in trade and war in bed mirrored a hierarchy as precise as the carvings on a ship's prow. At the top stood the jarls, the chieftains and nobles' men whose names carried weight enough to command warriors and arrange marriages across fjords. Beneath them were the carls, the freemen, farmers, traders, craftsmen who formed the backbone of Norse society. And at the bottom were the thralls, the enslaved. Captured in raids or born into bondage, their bodies were not their own. This pyramid didn't just determine who could own land or bear weapons. It also defined who could love freely and who could be taken without question. Sexuality was a form of currency in this world, a tool of alliance, a demonstration of ownership, sometimes even a substitute for war. Marriage for the Vikings was not a private vow of affection. It was a contract between families, a negotiation of property honour and fertility. A woman's hand was as strategic as a sword. Fathers and brothers arranged unions to secure alliances or land, and a bride's dowry, cattle, silver. Sometimes slaves sealed the transaction. But unlike in most of Christian Europe, this exchange did not strip the woman of rights. The dowry remained hers. Her husband managed it, but could not claim it as his own. Should the marriage end, she took it back. This legal autonomy gave Viking women a leverage nearly unthinkable in the rest of the medieval world. A noblewoman could walk away from a marriage richer than she entered it, and her reputation remained intact. Her body, her womb, her household, all were political assets, but not possessions. For the Jarl, sexuality extended far beyond the household. It was spectacle, diplomacy, and often theatre. A chief might offer his daughter in marriage to a rival clan to end a feud, or take a foreign concubine as a trophy of conquest. The wives and lovers of such men became living symbols of alliance or submission. Their offspring, legitimate or not, could alter the destiny of dynasties. Among the carls, the free men. The rules were more flexible, but still bound by honour. A man's reputation rested not only on bravery in battle, but on his conduct in intimacy. To seduce another man's wife or daughter without consent from her kin was not merely lust. It was an insult that demanded blood. Adultery in Viking law was less about betrayal of love and more about trespass upon another man's property and pride. Yet the same man could take lovers among slaves or captives without shame. And then there were the thralls, the invisible majority of Viking households. Women taken from Ireland, the Baltic or the Slavic lands. Men seized from monasteries or markets, children born to them, under the same roofs as their masters. They served, laboured and submitted. For them, sex was not a choice but a condition of survival. If a thrall woman bore a child by her master, that child's fate rested on his whim, acknowledged and freed or condemned to chains. This cruel fluidity blurred the lines between household and harem. In some longhouses, legitimate wives, secondary spouses and concubines shared the same hearth. Their hierarchies negotiated daily through glances, gifts and rivalries. A man's virility was a public matter. His lovers were emblems of wealth and reach. The more dependence he sustained, the more power he projected. Yet in the North, power could flow both ways. A clever woman, even a slave, could change her destiny through wit, beauty, or careful timing. Saga after saga tells of women who used seduction not as surrender, but as survival. In a world where lineage defined worth, to bear a powerful man's child was to claim a fragment of his immortality. Beneath this system ran an unspoken law: desire must serve status. Sex could bind oaths, settle debts, or declare dominance, but it could not cross the invisible lines of class without consequence. A freeman caught in a relationship with another man's slave might be fined or killed. A noblewoman sleeping with a thrall risked social ruin. And yet, in the dim spaces between raids and winters, those lines blurred all the same. There was another layer still: the ritual of public reputation, the social theatre where everyone's private acts were measured by gossip and saga. To be a real man was to command, to conquer, to father children. To be a good woman was to manage wealth and fertility, but also to wield cunning when needed. The Norse valued cleverness almost as much as courage, and that extended to the bedroom. A husband humiliated by his wife's wit was not mocked, he was warned. Thus, sexuality in Viking culture was never only about pleasure. It was a mirror held up to power, a negotiation of worth, lineage and reputation. What happened between two people was never just theirs. It echoed through their families, their clans, their souls. In this landscape, love was rare but not absent. Some sagas whisper of couples who defied custom, who married for affection rather than alliance. Their stories end not always in tragedy, but always in consequence, because love, like war, demanded payment. This was the social order of desire, a world where the body was a battlefield and the heart was a luxury few could afford. The polygamous elite, in the grand halls of the North power, did not sleep alone. To be a chieftain, a jarl, or a king in the Viking age was to live surrounded by women, wives, concubines, captives, and companions, each carrying her own story, her own rank in the quiet court of domestic diplomacy. Polygamy was not scandal, it was structure. Among the elite, it symbolized wealth and reached the physical proof that a man could provide, protect, and populate. A Viking ruler's household could resemble a miniature kingdom, a living map of his conquests and alliances, every woman a bridge between bloodlines. Yet even in this multiplicity order reigned. There was always one at the centre, the principal wife known in Old Norse as the hofudkona, literally the head woman. She was not merely a spouse, but a steward commanding servants, managing estates and often dictating household law. She held the keys quite literally. Keys hung from her belt during ceremonies as symbols of authority over food stores, property and domestic labour. Around her moved the secondary wives and concubines, women of various origins and fortunes. Some were noble daughters from allied families, others were captives from foreign raids, Irish, Slavic, Baltic. What distinguished them was not affection but contract. The hofudkona was wed through a formal alliance, her union sealed by witnesses' dowry and ritual. The others were accepted through private arrangement, their rights dependent on the favour of the man and the tolerance of the main wife. Yet the relationship between these women was rarely one of simple rivalry. In many sagas they formed webs of shifting alliance bound by shared children and shared peril. The principal wife's duty was not only to manage but to maintain peace, to balance jealousy with necessity, to ensure that her husband's pleasures did not fracture the household's power. In this she was diplomat and strategist both. Polygamy among the Norse elite was pragmatic. A jarl might marry the daughter of a neighbouring ruler to secure trade routes, then take another from a rival clan to end a feud. A foreign concubine might symbolise victory, her presence a living reminder of conquest. Yet marriage and captivity could merge into something more ambiguous. A woman captured in war might within years become a recognised spouse if she bore sons and proved her loyalty. This flexible structure reflected a society without rigid dogma. Before Christian missionaries arrived, Norse marriage was a contract of utility rather than sanctity. It could be dissolved, expanded or renewed as politics required. Fidelity was expected of wives, not of husbands. And yet the sagas reveal moments of intimacy, respect and even tenderness within these arrangements. A powerful man's affection for a single woman could alter the fates of others around him. Inheritance, however, remained a battlefield. Children of the principal wife stood first in line, their legitimacy undisputed. But secondary wives could shift the balance. If one of their sons showed promise in war or governance, a father might name him heir, triggering feuds that tore clans apart. Many Icelandic sagas hinge on such disputes, brothers born under the same roof, but of different mothers fighting for honour, land or memory. In this sense, Viking polygamy was less about lust than legacy. Each union produced not only children, but claims to property, power and identity. A jarl's bedchamber was his council hall, his family tree a political map. Yet there were limits. Polygamy required wealth. Maintaining multiple wives meant maintaining multiple households, each demanding servants' jewellery and livestock. Only the elite could afford it. For the average farmer, one wife was obligation enough. Thus multiplicity became a mark of class, a privilege that visually separated rulers from ruled. Religion played a subtle role too. Before conversion, fertility and virility were sacred attributes, gifts from the gods. To father many children was a form of divine favour. The god Freyr, patron of fertility and abundance, was often invoked during weddings and seasonal rites. The more wives a man had, the more the community saw him as favoured by the gods. But such abundance carried shadows. With many wives came many rivals. Poison, sorcery and accusation thread through the saga's ease. Quiet wars waged within the home. A slighted concubine could ruin reputations with whispers. A jealous principal wife could curse her husband's unborn heirs. These domestic dramas were not private scandals, they were public legends shaping how society understood the dangers of unbalanced desire. And yet for all its turbulence, this system granted women a peculiar kind of agency. The hofudkona held real influence, her word respected by men who ruled fleets. Her counsel was sought in matters of trade and revenge. Even secondary wives could rise through cunning. Saga heroines like Melkorka, said to be an Irish princess enslaved and later elevated to wife, embody that fragile but potent ladder between bondage and nobility. It is tempting to read these households as harems, but they were not simply collections of women. They were engines of diplomacy, weaving alliances across kingdoms, binding men through kinship when treaties alone would fail. As the fires burned low in the longhouse and the voices of warriors softened to murmurs, power was being forged not only in the forge, but in the bed. For the Viking elite, love was secondary. Legacy was everything. Women with power and their lovers. If the Viking Age taught a lesson about power, it is this: some of it wore a beard, and some of it carried keys. In Norse houses, a woman's authority was not whispered, it clinked audibly at her waist. The iron keys on a belt-grain store chest lock room were more than tools. They were a badge of office, the sign of a husfreyja, the mistress of the household, whose daily decisions could feed a crew finance, a voyage, or end a feud. And when such a woman outlived her husband, when she became a widow owning ship's pasture, and labour custom granted her a latitude nearly unthinkable elsewhere in medieval Europe, she could choose when to remarry, she could refuse entirely, she could keep lovers. Sagas do not speak of women as shadows, they name them as founders. Consider Un the deep-minded, also called Auda, a widow whose story unspools like a map. After her husband and son died abroad, Un liquidated wealth, commissioned a ship in secret, and sailed west with kin and dependents. She parcelled out land in Iceland as a chieftain would hosted feasts, arranged marriages, and died on her own terms, seated on a high seat during a celebration she had ordered. The text lingers not on her sorrow, but on her competence. She allocates, she judges, she disposes. When sagas later hint that such women could keep companions by preference, they do so without moral sermon. What matters is her sovereignty, not her chastity. Sagas and law codes together frame the architecture of that sovereignty. A Norse marriage was a contract between families, and a woman did not vanish into her husband's ledger. Her dowry heimanfylgja remained legally hers. The bride price munda was paid to her guardians, but she possessed a mourning gift morgengjöf from her husband, land, livestock, silver secured to her person. In divorce she could reclaim the dowry and often that mourning gift as well. In widowhood she was not returned to her father's household like a debtor to a bank. She stood as a legal actor with property witnesses and voice. Archaeology corroborates the paperwork. Graves of high-status women yield scales and weights used for trade silver, hacks, for payment by weight imported silks from the East, brooches anchoring, layered wool and linen that signalled rank, and most famous the Oseberg ship burial, 2 women interred with the carved wagons, sledges, tapestries, animals, tools for textile production on an almost industrial scale. One need not over-romanticize textile work to see its power cloth was currency. To command looms was to command wealth, right, and diplomacy. Many Scandinavian runestones were commissioned by women commemorating husbands, sons, or themselves with formulae that placed them as donors and decision-makers. Stone remembers who paid for stone. Within this framework, the latitude of elite women in intimacy becomes legible. A wealthy widow or landowning wife, especially one far from a meddling bishop, could entertain multiple suitors or maintain more than one partner across seasons of her life without sinking her reputation, provided discretion and household peace held. The sagas are franker than our textbooks. They do not present women as trapped ornaments. They show them as negotiators who could accept gifts, test loyalty, and dismiss the unworthy. When a woman of property took a companion, she did not fall. The man often of lower status rose, and with that rise came obligations of service and defence. This is not a rosy portrait of equality, it is a precise portrait of leverage. A woman's body, household, and lineage were instruments of policy, but unlike much of Christian Europe, she could play them herself. Where the Church prized virginity and indissoluble marriage, the Norse prized fitness. Does the match produce peace, heirs, labour advantage? If not, it can be recut. The measure is outcome, not purity. Even within marriages, elite women exercised agency that unsettles modern assumptions. They managed hospitality economies, the rhythm of seasonal feasts that converted stored wealth into political obligation. They approved or rejected gift-bearers at the door. They allocated textile tribute outfitting ships and warriors with sails and cloaks that travelled farther than any sword. And when a husband took secondary wives or concubines, it fell to the principal wife to govern the weather inside the house, to prevent rivalry from tipping into poison, to ensure that children, hers and others, were placed fostered and betrothed to the clan's advantage. That work of arrangement, quiet, constant, consequential, made her the household's chamberlain of destiny. Yet the same currents that carried a woman to power could drown her. Authority had to be performed daily in measured speech at the high seat, in fair dealing at the chest, in ritual presence at blot and lawthing. A misstep, public drunkenness, stinginess at a feast. A lover who brought shame instead of strength could be weaponized by rivals. The sagas relish such turns, a cutting verse sung at a doorway, a taunt on the law field, and suddenly the keys at her belt sound louder, heavier. Power for women, as for men, was a negotiation with gossip. Still the record returns to women who bent the rules and were not broken by them. The line between slave and spouse, between captive and matriarch, could rarely be crossed by a woman's wit. Stories survive of foreign-born women first taken as thralls, who through beauty, intelligence and shrewd timing secured manumission marriage and a seat at the household's centre. The transformation is not romantic, it is political. To bear a powerful man's child and to secure that child's acknowledgement was to convert vulnerability into stakeholding. In the ledger of the North, that was victory. Beyond saga pages, the ground keeps speaking. In cemeteries from Norway to the Baltic, women's graves are furnished not only with jewellery and keys, but with merchants' kits, folding, scales, nested weights, clipped silver, suggesting that some women transacted in markets and at harbours, possibly in their own right. In farmsteads, storeroom locks and specialised tool sets cluster in rooms interpreted as women's domains of control. And across eastern trade routes, the rivers to the Russ finds of glass beads, Arab coins, silk appear in female contexts, tracing the reach of women's consumption and exchange. What then of the lovers? The sagas are coy and the law practical. A woman who kept companions was expected to keep order. If her household ran, if her alliances held, if sons and daughters were placed well, private pluralities could be tolerated, especially in frontier societies, Iceland, Greenland, where distance from bishops and kings amplified local custom. Widows were the freest with heirs already acknowledged. And property in their own hand, they could choose intimacy for pleasure, counsel or protection. Some remarried serially, others never did, preferring the manoeuvrability of single rule. This is not anachronistic emancipation. It is Norwegian arithmetic: property plus kin plus reputation yields room to breathe. The wider the sum, the wider the room. Within that space, desire followed the same rule that governed ships and harvests: be useful. A lover who brought horses, men or news was useful. One who brought lawsuits was not. If the male code of the North obsessed over not being made passive, the female code obsessed over not being made irrelevant. Keys were not symbolic unless used. Lovers were not scandal unless they threatened the household's calculus. And so the women who endure in memory are those who kept balance and order, whose will read like a charter. Land-rich widows who could smile at a suitor, and with the same smile place him where he would do the least harm and the most good. The quiet historian's verdict is gentle but firm in the Viking world. Many things were negotiable oaths, borders, even gods, but arithmetic rarely lied. A woman with keys and land could redraw the map of intimacy to her advantage. She could take a lover and keep a kingdom, and the stone, the silver, the ships, they testify that she often did. Divorce, freedom, and the law of equality. If love was a contract in the Viking world, then divorce was its release clause, swift, legal, and astonishingly fair for its time. Long before modern courts or feminist movements, Norse women had the right to do what queens and peasants alike in Christian Europe could scarcely dream of: to walk away. The law recognized marriage as a mutual alliance, not a divine prison. What bound it was property and consent, and what could dissolve it was the loss of either. A husband could end the union by sending his wife back to her kin and returning her dowry. A wife could do the same, provided she had witnesses and reason. But reason in this world was defined far more broadly than the moral codes of the rest of medieval Europe would ever allow. According to the Icelandic law code Gragas, compiled in the early 12th century but rooted in Viking custom, a woman could initiate divorce for causes that to modern ears sound both practical and boldly personal. If her husband was impotent, if he struck her 3 times, if he failed to provide for her, or even if he wore women's clothing, she could declare the marriage void. No priest, bishop or king had to approve. No parchment needed sealing. The procedure was ritual but simple. Standing in the doorway of her home, the woman would call witnesses, usually neighbours, and announce her intention. "I divorce you," she might say, "as I am witness to myself and to the gods." Then she would step out, literally crossing the threshold, and repeat the declaration before another witness. That act of stepping out symbolised reclaiming her autonomy. Once spoken twice, the divorce was final. Her dowry returned to her. The mourning gift, the morgengjöf, her husband had given after their wedding night, was hers to keep. Any property or wealth gained during the marriage was divided by custom, often with surprising equity. A woman wronged in marriage was not expected to crawl back to her father's hearth in disgrace. She could remain on her land, manage her estate, or remarry freely. The sagas do not treat divorced women as ruined. Quite the opposite. They reappear commanding households, arranging marriages for their children, and in some cases marrying again for advantage or affection. Divorce was a tool, not a stigma. One story tells of Hallgerdur Höskuldsdottir, a formidable Icelandic woman from Njal's saga, who divorced her first husband after he slapped her. Her decision was final, legal, and publicly respected. No ecclesiastical authority intervened, no confession was required. By contrast, in Christian Europe of the same century, a woman beaten by her husband had virtually no recourse. Marriage was indissoluble, sanctified by God and governed by men. Even queens could not escape, as the tragic case of Eleanor of Aquitaine's annulment battles shows, unless politics, not justice, intervened. In the north, however, law and pragmatism often outweighed piety. Marriage existed to stabilize families and secure property, not to glorify suffering. If the alliance ceased to serve its purpose, it could be undone with dignity. This system did not make men and women equal, but it allowed both to negotiate equality. The law recognized female agency not as rebellion, but as necessity. A woman abandoned in a harsh climate without the power to sever a failed union would starve. The Norse solution was practical survival, first sentiment later. The independence granted by divorce also served to protect lineage. If a husband was sterile, a wife could leave him and remarry, ensuring her family's continuity. In a world where ancestry was both record and religion, that right was sacred. The gods demanded heirs, not chastity. Witnesses were essential because they transformed private desire into public legitimacy. Every declaration at the door at the boundary stone at the assembly field echoed through the community, confirming that the act was lawful and free of deceit. Divorce was not hidden, it was performed. That transparency paradoxically preserved dignity on both sides. Compare this to the rest of Europe around the year 1000. In Francia, England and the Holy Roman Empire, marriage had already fallen under the tightening grip of the Church. The Council of Verbery in 752 had declared marriage indissoluble once consummated. By the 11th century, clerics like Peter Damian and Pope Gregory VII would treat any sexual act outside monogamous marriage as sin. A woman who fled a cruel or impotent husband was seen as adulterous, her body bound by sacrament, even if her soul screamed for release. Property too vanished into her husband's hands upon marriage. What she brought he kept. What she earned he owned. The Norse world followed different scripture, the law of balance. A marriage was a ship, not a cathedral. If it leaked beyond repair, you left it before it sank. And yet this freedom did not mean chaos. Divorce was serious. It had consequences for inheritance and reputation. But it was not moral failure. Communities recognized that human unions like harvests could spoil. The goal was not purity, but function, the steady continuity of kin. Even the language of their law carries that clarity. The word for marriage, brudel means bride running, suggesting movement, not permanence. It was a journey taken together, not an eternal chain. So when a Viking woman stood in her doorway calling witnesses to the end of her marriage, she was not defying tradition, she was fulfilling it. She was exercising the same rights that allowed her to inherit trade and testify in court. Her voice had legal weight, her ways the force of law. Centuries later, the Church would sweep this autonomy away, replacing it with vows and sin, confession and penance. But for a few remarkable centuries in the windswept north, women could say no, and the law listened. It is easy to see why later historians glossed over these customs. They complicated the myth of barbarism. They suggested that a so-called pagan society had built a system of marriage more humane, more flexible, and arguably more just than the Christian kingdoms that came after it. The Vikings believed that honour was not in endurance but in agency, not in the endurance of pain but in the courage to choose. And when love turned to silence or respect to fear, they knew how to walk out keys still at their belts, heads held high into whatever future they would make for themselves. Honour. Masculinity and the obsession with passivity. In the north, a man's body was not his own. It was an emblem he carried before the world, a carved prow moving through the sea of other men's eyes. What mattered was not appetite, nor even fidelity. What mattered was direction. To act upon others was manly. To be acted upon was ruin. The Old Norse word at the centre of this storm is ergi, a cluster of meanings that refuses to sit still, unmanliness, softness, moral looseness, being like a woman. Its adjective, arga, also jugir, was among the deadliest accusations a tongue could shape. To call a man arga was to say he had been made passive in speech, in magic, in sex, and therefore stripped of honour. The insult did not merely stain, it unmade. Viking Age law took words with deadly seriousness. In the Icelandic tradition later compiled as Gragas, certain slanders were so grave that they triggered immediate rites of retaliation. Among them were phrases that marked a man as sexually used as a woman, or implied that he had submitted to penetration. These were not idle taunts. They were socially explosive charges that could legally be washed away only with blood or public redress. The man so named could demand retraction duel or compensation. If refused, he might even pursue lethal vengeance without incurring the full weight of outlawry. Why such ferocity over a word? Because Norse masculinity anchored itself in a simple moral algebra: agency equals honour. On the battlefield, that meant striking first. In politics, it meant commanding dependence. In bed, it meant penetration, the active role. The act itself was not policed by gender of partner, as modern categories would assume. The position was. A man who took the active role with another man could still be considered virile. The man who received was a branded arger, his social death pronounced in a syllable. This is the paradox of a culture both flexible and fierce. The Vikings did not build their sexual ethics around the Christian idea of sin. They built it around the pagan idea of status. A chieftain could keep multiple wives and concubines without scandal. A freeman could sleep with slaves and captives without shame. Yet if either allowed himself to be placed in the female role, his entire identity collapsed. The act was less important than the hierarchy embedded in the act. Accusations of ergi also reached beyond the bedchamber into the realm of magic. The ecstatic practice of cedar, associated with the goddess Freya, and often performed by women, was condemned as unmanly for men, precisely because it required the practitioner to receive spirits to submit to trance. Even Odin is mocked in myth, for learning cedar of Loki's jeers are aimed not at sorcery per se, but at a god who compromised the posture of the conqueror. In a world where passivity equaled pollution, a man who relinquished control even ritually flirted with social self-undoing. Comparative anthropology reveals that this logic is not unique to the North. In classical Rome, moralists drew a line between the vir, proper male, and the synodus, the man marked by softness, where the stigma clung not to desire, but to receptivity. In many warrior societies, from steppe confederations to Mediterranean city-states, honor codes orbit the same sun. Domination preserves masculine rank. Submission cancels it. The Norse, however, inscribed that orbit more explicitly into law, making the tongue's wound a justiciable offence. The sagas staged this anxiety with cruel clarity. A hero may be fearless in battle, yet undone by a poet's cutting verse that hints he is arguy. The proper response is never apology, it is action. He summons witnesses, sets the terms, and demands satisfaction. To let the word rest on him is to accept transformation into a thing, a vessel, a whole, and the language for that transformation is always feminizing. To remain a man, he must reassert agency with a deed everyone can see. Under this code, sexual violence can become a weapon of war, not driven by lust, but by the calculus of unmaking another man. To force a captive into the passive role is to perform a public conversion from free to unfree, from warrior to spoil. The perpetrators do not see themselves as deviant, they see themselves as supremely masculine, their cruelty a ritual of dominance. It is a social killing that leaves the body breathing. There are radiating consequences in domestic life as well. A husband who cannot master his household, whose wife openly mocks him, whose rivals imply he is arger, is not merely unhappy. He is vulnerable before the law and before his peers. Conversely, a man who accuses recklessly risks unleashing a chain of challenges and blood that could end in exile. The code is a razor, it cuts the weak and it sometimes cuts the hand that wields it. Listen closely to the words that carry the charge. They often hinge on the grammar of being done to have been written, to have been used, to have been made into. The passive voice in language mirrors the passive status in society. Norse insult poetry harnesses this grammar like a weapon, painting opponents as unmen through images of inversion. Law then steps in as the ritual bath, a way to cleanse the stain through duel, fine, or killing. None of this made Viking men loveless or numb. The same sagas that obsess over ergi also preserve friendships of startling tenderness, oaths of foster brotherhood, sealed with tears, fathers who cradle infants like treasure. But the public code stood over them like a cold sky. However a man loved, he had to stand in the wind of that code and not be blown backward. The cost was high. A culture that equates receptivity with ruin narrows the field of permissible emotion. It breeds bravado, weaponizes intimacy, and turns the body into a fortress that must never open its gates. Some men survived it brilliantly. Some broke on it like ships on rock. And yet to grasp this harsh geometry is to understand the logic beneath other Viking contradictions, why a man could boast of seducing enemies' wives, but would kill a poet for a single insinuation. Why a god of war could learn women's magic and still be jeered for it. Why the loudest insult in the North was not coward or thief, but the softest of verbs to be used. In the Viking world, masculinity was a position as much as a virtue, a stance maintained in law, in ritual in bed. To keep it, a man had to move first, strike first, speak first. Above all, he had to act. For to be acted upon to be named Argo was not merely shame, it was a social death, worse than murder, because murder ends a life, but ergi ends a name, sex as weapon, humiliation and warfare. War in the Viking world did not end when the swords fell silent, it continued in the grammar of the body. The captured enemy could be stripped not only of weapons and wealth, but of status, and the most feared form of that stripping was sexualized humiliation. This was not about desire. It was about unmaking a man in the eyes of his peers. The code we met in the last part, where agency defines honour, gave victors a cruel instrument. If manhood is public action, then forcing an enemy into the passive position performs his social death. The Norse had a word for the new thing. He became Arga unman, unfree, unfit to stand, and among equals. To make someone Argo was to cancel his name. The sagas circle this power, with a mix of threat rumour and ritual insult. They seldom narrate the act in lurid detail. The point was never the bedroom, but the verdict. Skalds sharpened the blade with Ned abusive verse, casting foes as mares ridden as objects used as men reversed into the role they most feared. Poles called Nidstung were raised against enemies carved with obscene insinuations and set on boundary lines so that every passerby would read the verdict of unmanliness upon the targeted man or clan. Law codes treated accusations of being used like a woman as so incendiary that they justified immediate retaliation. The system did not need the scene described. The suggestion was enough to set blood moving. Within that logic, sexual violence against male captives becomes legible as a tactic, publicised the shift from warrior to spoil, from agent to vessel. The deed was often gestured to more than narrated because the wound mattered most in reputation. A survivor might live, but he returned to his people bearing a silence heavier than chains to speak of. It would confirm it to deny, it would invite the duel. That law allowed an accused Argo to demand and to remain mute, was to carry the rumour like a brand. The Norse were not alone in this cruelty. Across cultures, armies have dressed victory in the same dark grammar. Rome moralists of the late Republic and early Empire drew hard lines between the vir, the active honourable male, and the submissors. A defeated enemy violated by victors was not recorded as an erotic episode, but as proof that he had been remade into a thing. Roman invective. Cicero's barbs at Antony Catullus's taunts relies on the same logic: not you desired wrongly, but you were used, therefore you are less. Byzantium court chronicles relish punishments that feminized rebels' public shavings, parades in women's garb, castrations that converted rivals into eunuchs, suitable only for service. Here too the violence is not private lust. It is policy subtracting a man's capacity to beget heirs, to found houses, to stand as a peer. Medieval West tales from Norman Angevin and later crusading fronts carry rumours of captives shamed by the forced exposure, compelled gestures or penetrative assaults, meant to taint lineage and memory. Monastic writers condemn the acts as sodomy. Soldiers deploy them as spectacle to unmanned garrisons without fighting them twice. The continuity is chilling. When masculinity is defined as never being acted upon, then the surest way to erase an enemy is to act upon him in the one domain that claims to be private but is always in wartime public theatre. Norse literature preserves the aftershocks. A skald hints that a rival was ridden and the hall freezes. Men know what such a line can cost. A warrior lifts a nidstong and plants it where the road will carry the insult farthest. A captain victorious spares the bodies of the fallen and turns to the living, knowing that a single staged humiliation can dissolve an enemy's cohesion more efficiently than a dozen funerals. The law stands nearby like a witness who can't leave in Gragas to name a man as the Nidinga. The unmanned see fate, and by imputing passivity is to ignite a legal fuse whose end is dual fine or exile. The society writes the script, soldiers perform it. None of this means the North was uniquely depraved. It means the North was honest in its own way about how power moves through flesh. Where other chronicles hide the deed and linger on the triumphal arch, the sagas preserve the mechanism, the poem that plants the rumour, the pole that fixes it to earth, the law that turns words into weapons. There is a cost that the texts rarely say aloud. Men who returned from captivity under such shadows fought not only for land again, but for language, for a way back into sentences where they were subjects and not objects. Some won it with valour, some with marriage and sons, some never at all. The silence in the sagas around explicit scenes is not prudery. It is the silence of radioactive memory. Everyone knows what was being said. No one needs it spelled. When we lay these patterns side by side, the Roman invective, the Byzantine parade, the Scandinavian need, we see a single design sexualized humiliation as political technology. It converts victory into hierarchy, fear into obedience. It warns the living more than it punishes the defeated. And because it operates in symbols everyone recognizes, it survives conversion, migration, and reform. Christian kings and pagan jarls alike understood it perfectly. The quiet historian's verdict is not sensational but simple in the age of the Vikings. Sex could be a sword that left no blood on the floor. It cut through reputation, through inheritance, through the idea of a man. And when a society writes honours us, the deepest wound is the one that declares before witnesses that a man has been acted upon. Magic, gender, and the curse of Seida. Before there were bishops and bells in the north, there were women who sang the world into focus. They came with staffs and soft furs with rings of bronze that chimed when they moved with bags of curious seeds and carved bone. A hush followed them like a cloak. People called them volure seeresses, and the craft they practiced was Seida. Seida was not temple magic. It was hearth magic, threshold magic, the kind that bends probability the way a seasoned sailor leans a sail into wind. It could summon luck whither an enemy's resolve tug at the threads of fate that the Norns had already spun. It worked through trance and touch and breath. A seeress might mount a raised platform, the Sagigala, and let her voice become a chord between worlds, while other women circled her with a Vardlokur, a calling song that steadied her crossing. Everything about the rite read as female-coded to Norse eyes, the spindle and distaff of spinning, the yielding body that receives a spirit, the patience of waiting the craft of entangling rather than striking. Men respected its results. They feared its price. For in a culture where honour was the art of acting, Seida demanded the courage to be acted upon, to open to forces, to host them, to let them move through you. That posture, the posture of receptivity, brushed against the most radioactive word in the Norse lexicon. A man who entered that posture, who sat where women sat, who let his breath be driven instead of driving it, risked the stain of unmanliness. He became suspect, a Sidmada, a man of cedar whose power smelled of taboo. And yet at the centre of Norse cosmology stands a god who did precisely this. Odin, the High One, the hanged god who traded an eye for wisdom and 9 nights for runes. Learned Seida from Freya. Freya, the Vanna goddess of love, war and wealth, was the acknowledged mistress of the craft, its patroness and exemplar. She rides a chariot pulled by cats, wears the necklace Brisingamen, and gathers fallen warriors as surely as Odin does. She teaches him what only women are supposed to know. The myths refuse to make this clean. In the poem Lokasenna, where Loki strolls through a feast insulting gods by turns his spear as language and his target is shame, he mocks Odin for practicing Seida like a witch, implying ergi that the father of armies performed unmanly rites. Loki's jeer is not that sorcery is false, it is that the greatest god submitted. In a world obsessed with stance, Loki accuses Odin of having sat. The charge lands because everyone in the hall understands the code. Seida's power comes at a gendered cost. Where Galdor magical chanting can be loud, declarative, and legibly masculine, Seida is sinuous. It coils. It feels. It requires the practitioner to lean into the invisible, to let something other take the initiative. For women, this posture matches the culture's expectations and grants them sanctioned authority. The vulva may be poor or noble, but when she sings, men hush. For men, the identical posture threatens the very definition of manhood crafted by lore and saga. Archaeology gives the Volure back their hands and tools. Across graves from Norway to the Baltic we find iron or bronze staffs, some curved like shepherd's crooks, some capped with mud laid beside women dressed in finery beads of glass and amber scales, and weights, herb pouches, animal bones, sometimes miniature seats. The Oseberg ship burial, 2 women interred with lavish goods, has long been read as a ritual centre, as much as a tomb, its tapestries whispering of processions and rites. At Firkat in Denmark, a woman was buried with a wand-like staff and a purse of henbane seeds, a plant notorious for inducing vision and frenzy. The graves do not sermonize, They simply confirm that women held the implements of crossing. Myth expands the frame. Norse gods themselves are fluid in ways that outstrip later moral categories. Loki changes shape as easily as a rumour he becomes a mare is impregnated by a stallion and later births Sleipnir's eight-legged horse. In Thrym's Kvidr, Thor hardest hammer in the sky must don Freya's dress a bridal veil and keys to retrieve his stolen weapon, performing femininity so over the top it becomes farce. The poem plays the scene for laughter, but the joke wobbles on an edge. Under the silk the god is still a god, and when the veil falls giants die. The universe of the Eddas allows crossing, borrowing, masking, and then yanks the mask off to reassure the audience that the old order remains intact. What then is Sida's real offence? Not that it is women's work, but that it exposes the fiction at the heart of the masculine code. It proves that knowledge requires yielding, that there are truths one can only catch by letting them pass through you. Odinin knows this in his bones. He dangles from the windswept tree not as conqueror, but as supplicant, receiving the runes as gifts after pain. He drinks from Mimir's well by paying with his eye. Wisdom in Norse myth is transactional and humbling. Cider is simply that humility ritualized. Freyr and Njord are gods of the Vanir. A divine clan associated with fertility, sea wealth and treaty-making complicate the picture further. Their power is generative rather than punitive, their prestige tied to increase of harvests of flocks of peace. To seek such increase through Sida is to perform a politics of entanglement, not domination, precisely the politics elite men feared to embody. The anxiety is cultural before it is sexual. What if the most effective power is not the sword but the net? What if influence means letting yourself be caught, and yet the same society that shamed male Sid workers needed what they could do? A chieftain wanting to turn a storm, a family desperate for a child, a voyage needing luck, someone called a practitioner. If a respected woman could be found, her presence sanctified the rite. If not, a man might step across the line and pay the reputational price in whispers he hoped success would drown. Power in the North is forever a bargain with risk. Cider makes the bargain visible. The sagas sometimes let us witness the negotiation. A vulva is welcome with gifts, seated high-fed, a stew of hearts and fat to strengthen second sight. She names fates and asks for song. Men who would never sit at a loom find themselves humming as the Vardlokkur rises. The room's boundary blurs as a communal voice becomes the ladder the seeress climbs. When she speaks, the chieftain bows his head. Gender does not vanish here. It is suspended for the sake of result. Afterward, daily law snaps back into place like ice, and people pretend the suspension did not prove anything. There is an honesty to Norse myth that modern readers sometimes miss. The stories do not resolve the tension between acting and receiving, they stage it. Loki's mockery of Odin is remembered because it hurts. It hurts because it is half true. Odinin's greatness lies not only in ravens and spears, but in his willingness to pay with pride for knowledge others want for free. The culture both needs that posture and punishes it when worn by the wrong body. So Seda sits in the saga hall like a beautiful, dangerous instrument, a harp that can call wind into a sail, a net that can gather luck, a mirror that shows you what you most fear, that strength sometimes looks like yielding, and that the line between the two is thin as a thread drawn from a distaff. Women could play that instrument openly. Men, when they dared, played it in shadow and pretended afterward that their hands had never trembled. The quiet historian's verdict is not to absolve or condemn, but to notice a society that writes honour as conquest will always fear the powers that work by consent and receptivity, and yet in its oldest stories even its highest god breaks his own rule to learn what only the open can learn. Between Freyja's song and Loki's jeer, the North admitted a secret to steer fate. You sometimes have to be steered, and the bravest act is knowing when to let the wind take you. Marriage as theatre. Marriage in the Viking world was not a private promise whispered under candlelight. It was theatre, and every gesture on that stage mattered: the grain of the wood beneath the couple's feet, the smell of ale and smoke, the witnesses leaning close to confirm that what was said and done would bind not only two people but two bloodlines. The saga's sources open like curtains on these ceremonies. The air smells of roasted meat, pine resin, and anticipation. The groom arrives with gifts, silver weapons, livestock, his cloak clasped by the hands of kin. The bride comes veiled, led by her family, her belt heavy with the keys that mark her new domain. These keys polished and strung at her waist are not ornaments. They are symbols of sovereignty. The moment she steps across her husband's threshold, she becomes husfreyja, mistress of the household, keeper of food stores, weaver of sails, accountant of wealth. When she hands those keys to her daughter decades later, it will mean the same thing. It means tonight that the household's lifeblood runs through women's hands. The ceremony itself blends pragmatism and sanctity. There are no priests in the early period, no script sanctified by the church. Instead, there are witnesses, ale, and oaths sworn before the gods. The groom strikes a sword into the ceiling beam, a gesture older than memory, symbolizing that his lineage will continue through this union. The blade glints above them, like a frozen flash of lightning, half weapon, half blessing. Cups pass in ritual order, his family to hers, hers to his. Every sip seals a contract written in mead and memory. But what follows after the feast is stranger to modernize the consummation ritual, a blend of voyeurism and legality. The couple is escorted to the bridal chamber by witnesses who wait just outside the door, listening for sounds that will confirm the act has begun. Sometimes, when silence stretches too long, they enter politely, awkwardly, to verify evidence of union, rumpled bedding, torn cloth, perhaps blood on the sheets if the bride was virgin. The purpose is not moral policing, it is proof of alliance fulfilled. The union's not valid until the community acknowledges that flesh has sealed what words began. In this Viking marriage differs sharply from later Christian ceremony. There is no talk of sin or sanctity. The gods are invoked not to purify passion, but to bless fertility and stability. The family does not hide the body's role, it displays it because desire is the engine of inheritance. A union that fails to produce heirs is not tragic but defective, a breach of contract. The bride's new status is marked by her belt and her keys, but also by her seat in the hall. She sits beside her husband's high seat, equal in visibility if not always in authority. Her responsibilities begin at once: distribution of food, oversight of servants, management of trade goods. A Viking household was an economic organism, farm workshop and shipyard combined. To marry was to merge enterprises as much as hearts. And yet, despite the practical foundations, the Norse did not see marriage as cold transaction. The sagas reveal tenderness within the structure, a man and woman exchanging private gifts beneath public expectation, a wife weaving her husband's name into embroidery, a husband composing verses that carry his longing across seas. But sentiment floated on a current of duty. Love was admired when it strengthened alliances, frowned upon when it disrupted them. Still within this discipline there was room for subtle defiance. A clever bride could use her keys as a kind of leverage. She might control when and how her husband entertained guests, which dependents received aid, or which sons were favoured in inheritance. The household, in effect, was a miniature realm, and like any realm, it required diplomacy. A woman's rule was quiet but constant, her influence woven through every decision masked as practicality. The publicity of marriage served another purpose: social cohesion. The feast gathered not just kin, but entire communities, binding neighbours into networks of obligation. To attend a wedding was to witness a social promise to respect property boundaries, to aid in disputes, to honour shared lineage. The louder the feast, the stronger the signal that this family was stable, capable of hospitality worth allying with. Even the voyeurism of consummation, unsettling to modern sensibilities, performed a social function. It ensured that no whispers could later challenge legitimacy. In a society without centralised bureaucracy, documentation or birth certificates, memory and witness were law. The bedding witnesses were the living archive of lineage, the human equivalent of notarized seals. The result was a kind of collective choreography. Every wedding performed, every song repeated, reinforced the fragile architecture of Norse society. Land was scarce, kin ties complex, winter unforgiving. Marriage kept order in a landscape that could otherwise unravel. Property stability rested on knowing who belonged to whom, whose field bordered, whose son would inherit which plot, whose alliances would hold when tempers broke. From the outside, Viking marriage seems earthy, even crude. From within, it was sacred pragmatism, a binding of fortunes and fates through ritual precision. To marry was to stitch two names into one fabric to create not just a family but a durable contract of survival. When Christianity arrived, priests tried to replace mead with mass, witnesses with sacraments, passion with piety. But for generations afterward, echoes of the old theatre lingered. Brides still wore keys. Grooms still struck beams, and communities still gathered to eat, to sing and to watch. Two people crossed the threshold together, knowing that their private act would carry the weight of a public promise. In the flickering torchlight of that ancient hall, the wedding was not merely a ceremony. It was civilization rehearsing its own continuity, love, property, and community bound together by hands, voices, and eyes that did not look away. Between desire and duty, virginity and control. In the candle-lit corners of the longhouse behind laughter and song, the Norse managed a secret balance between what they desired and what society demanded. It was a culture not of abstinence, but of containment. Where Christian Europe equated purity with virtue, the Vikings measured morality in order a well-run farm, a stable lineage, a household that produced heirs without scandal. Premarital sex was not taboo in itself. It was expected that young men and women might test affection, curiosity, or fertility before marriage, but it was expected also that they would do so discreetly. Virginity was not a sacred ideal. Discretion was. What mattered was that no pregnancy disrupted inheritance lines and that no affair insulted another man's honour. A girl's reputation depended less on whether she had lovers than on whether those affairs caused trouble. If she bore a child before marriage, the issue was not sin but property. Whose name would the child carry, who would support it, whose family would be responsible for its future. In a society built on alliances and bloodlines, ambiguity was dangerous. Bastardy complicated inheritance. Illegitimate children blurred the borders of clan and estate. Thus, rather than repress sexuality, the Vikings managed it with custom medicine and cunning. Old herbal lore scattered through later Icelandic texts and confirmed by botanical studies speaks of plants like juniper berries, wild carrot seeds, and angelica root used to prevent conception. Women brewed teas, burned herbs, or carried pouches of protective mixtures said to cool the womb. Midwives and healers practiced what modern scholars call folk contraception, a practical knowledge born of observation, not doctrine. There were also abortifacient herbs whispered of but rarely named in lore, or saga pennyroyal, yarrow rue, and henbane. Some were steeped in ale, others burned in secret rituals under the guidance of wise women. Their existence tells us something crucial, that the Viking world did not see reproduction as automatic virtue. A woman was expected to control her fertility as she controlled her household with prudence and foresight. The line between acceptable and forbidden behaviour was drawn not at desire, but at disruption. A discreet lover was tolerated, a public scandal endangered a family's standing. Gossip could ruin more effectively than violence. The sagas echo with such moral calculus, men and women punished not for passion, but for carelessness. In Laxdale saga, the beautiful Gudrun Osvifsdottir, a woman of fierce independence, takes lovers and chooses her marriages with shrewd intent. Her liaisons are judged not by priests but by their outcomes. Alliances made hearts broken, blood spilled. The story does not call her wicked. It calls her wise, tragic human, a woman whose freedom mirrors her society's acceptance of complexity. Even the customs surrounding virginity were pragmatic. During wedding rituals, proof of virginity, blood on the sheets, was sometimes expected but not universally valued. It was a symbol of fertility, not of moral worth. A non-virgin bride, if honest and well-born, could still marry respectably. What mattered was that her future husband knew the truth, and that no rival could claim her child as his own. The community's eye was less on behaviour and more on results. A well-managed household that kept peace, raised strong children, and honoured kin obligations could forgive nearly anything behind closed doors. Desire was seen as a natural force like fire, dangerous if uncontrolled, useful if contained. The sagas treat seduction with the same earthy realism they apply to farming or trade. A flirtation might be compared to tending cattle done properly. It strengthens the stock. Done recklessly, it wrecks the pasture. Even the gods reflect this moral geometry. Freyja, goddess of love and fertility, is both revered and teased for her appetite. The myths neither condemn nor sanctify her. They simply acknowledge that desire is part of the divine fabric, too powerful to banish, too essential to ignore. Yet this tolerance had boundaries. Sexual autonomy belonged mainly to the free. Thralls enslaved women had no agency, their bodies legally, their master's property. Their pregnancies too were transactions. A master who acknowledged his child might elevate both mother and offspring. One who refused could condemn them to servitude. In this, Viking society's pragmatism revealed its cruelty. The order it prized was often built on other people's silence. Still within its own logic, the North saw sexuality as functional, not moralistic. It was bound to cycles of life-sowing, harvest, winter feasts, spring fertility rites. To copulate in the fields during spring festivals was not scandalous but sacred, an act believed to strengthen the earth itself. The gods were invoked not to shame but to bless the union of flesh and soil. This worldview left little room for guilt but plenty for responsibility. Men and women were expected to manage their passions as they managed livestock or weather anticipate channel, avoid disaster. A failed harvest or an illegitimate birth both meant the same thing, negligence. When Christianity arrived with its doctrines of virginity, celibacy and original sin, it collided with this older sensibility. The church preached that the body was fallen. The Norse believed the body was useful. Missionaries urged repentance. Farmers asked how to keep their family lines alive. Conversion took centuries not because the Vikings refused faith, but because they refused to surrender a worldview that worked a system where sex law and survival formed one pragmatic web. Seen through that lens, Viking sexuality was not libertine chaos, but order through honesty. They understood desire as whether impossible to outlaw, only to prepare for. Their concern was never purity, only stability, and in that realism lies their strange modernity. They accepted what later ages would deny, that human beings, even in a world of gods and battles, are creatures of flesh before they are creatures of doctrine. In the Norse longhouse, firelight made no distinction between sacred and profane. It only asked one question: does this keep us alive? If the answer was yes, then desire too had its place beside the hearth. Slavery and sexual power. Among all the contradictions of the Viking world, none is sharper than this: a society that prized freedom built itself upon the lives of those who had none. They called them thralls, men and women captured in raids, born of slaves or purchased in the bustling markets of Dublin, Hedeby or Birka. To be a thrall was not simply to serve, it was to disappear from law, to exist as property, as breath without name. In that absence of rights, the body itself became the only negotiable asset. For thrall women, sex was neither sin nor privilege, it was survival. They could be used, gifted, traded, or discarded without recourse. The sagas and law codes state this plainly. A man might use his slave woman as he wished, and any child born from the union was his property. The moral vocabulary of the church, words like rape or virtue, did not apply here. There was no crime, because there was no person in the legal sense to suffer it. Yet inside this brutal system, something else moved a slow current of cunning and adaptation. Some enslaved women learned to transform what little agency they possessed into power, weaving advantage out of danger. Their stories flicker through the sagas like embers that refuse to die. One of the most striking is that of Melkorka in Laxdæla saga. When first mentioned, she is a silent slave purchased in Iceland by a chieftain named Hoskuld. She is beautiful, aloof, and refuses to speak a single word. Months pass before he learns that she is not mute, but hiding her identity, an Irish princess captured in war. She bears him a son, Olaf, who grows to be a respected leader. In time, Melkorka regains a semblance of dignity through her intelligence and bearing. Her child becomes a bridge between servitude and status. She never fully escapes the mark of slavery, but she bends its shape into lineage. Other tales echo the same pattern. The sagas tell of captives from the British Isles who became concubines and later wives, their beauty and wit securing favour in households that once owned them. The transformation was rare and perilous, but not impossible. In a society where bloodlines and inheritance defined destiny, the mother of a man's son, even if born a thrall, could alter the arithmetic of power. These women navigated a world that valued cunning almost as much as courage. They learned when to speak, when to listen, when to charm, and when to retreat into silence. Seduction for them was not indulgence, it was strategy. It could win manumission, protection, or influence over domestic affairs. In certain cases, a thrall who bore her master's acknowledged child might be freed to legitimize the offspring, raising both herself and her child out of bondage. The Norse word for freeing a slave, leysingr, shares its root with release, and many who were released remained bound by loyalty or gratitude. Yet those bonds could become ladders. A freed woman with charm and ambition could become a mistress of a household, managing her former master's property, negotiating trades, and occasionally manipulating inheritance. Still, for every Melkorka who ascended, there were countless nameless women who did not. Archaeology reveals their silence graves with no jewellery, no tools, sometimes only a knife or comb bones showing heavy labour, malnutrition, and the traces of childbirth. These were the bodies upon which Viking prosperity was built, the unseen scaffolding of a warrior's freedom. The sexual economy of slavery blurred moral boundaries that later historians tried to draw clean. A man's virility in Viking eyes was affirmed by his ability to command bodies and territory alike. Owning a thrall woman and using her was part of that display. but if he favoured her too openly, he risked his wife's wrath and social derision. Thus the household became a quiet theatre of power, where intimacy, jealousy and hierarchy performed an endless, dangerous dance. Some sagas hint at domestic dramas so volatile they rival battles. The Njal saga references disputes born from divided loyalties between a wife of status and a beloved concubine. The wife might tolerate the arrangement so long as her authority remained intact. Should the concubine bear a son and the master grow affectionate, the hall could split along invisible lines, servants whispering, children watching alliances fracturing. For the enslaved woman this was a razor's edge. She had to captivate without threatening pleas, without seeming ambitious love in a way that preserved the illusion of subservience. Failure could mean beating sail or worse. Success might mean freedom, wealth, or a grave beside her master rather than beneath the earth of a field. The contradictions multiplied after death. Some freedwomen were buried with key symbols of domestic authority usually reserved for freeborn wives. Others lay beside the men they had served, their equality achieved only in the stillness of the tomb. These burials, though few, suggest that affection could sometimes pierce the armour of a class, that even within the machinery of exploitation, attachment, however warped, could take root. Comparative historians find echoes of this dynamic across the medieval world in the Byzantine palaces, where eunuchs and concubines wielded invisible influence, in the Abbasid harems where a slave concubine could bear a caliph's heir, in Frankish courts where servant mistresses quietly directed patronage networks. Everywhere the pattern repeats: when law erases, a person's power slips through the cracks in law. The Vikings, pragmatic as ever, did not pretend otherwise. To them, slavery was neither shame nor sin, but simply the shadow of success. Every raid that brought back silver also brought back people. Those people cooked, spun, mended, warmed the beds, and bore the children who would populate the next generation's sagas. The system required constant forgetting, a cultural blindness to the fact that freedom's feast was served on bondage's table. And yet within that blindness individuals manoeuvred. Some thralls learned to speak the language of their masters better than the masters themselves. Some wielded gossip as deftly as a sword, reshaping alliances from within. Some raised sons who would one day rule the lands where their mothers had once been owned. The sagas never moralize about this. They record it with the same even tone they give to storms and swords. In their world, power has no stable home, it moves through cunning lineage and luck. A slave woman might become a matriarch, and a freeman's daughter might fall into bondage. Fortune spun like a spindle, indifferent to who held it yesterday. The quiet historian's verdict is a hard one. The Viking Age celebrated courage and freedom while depending on coercion and fear. And nowhere was that hypocrisy clearer than in the bed of a slave where dominance met dependency and survival itself could wear the mask of desire. The sacred and the carnal rituals of fertility. When winter finally slackened its jaw and the first thawed rivulets stitched the fields back together, the North remembered what all hungry countries know. Life is negotiation. You feed the land, and the land feeds you if the gods are willing. And so the Vikings made willingness into ritual. They called the great offerings blot sacrifices given not out of meekness, but of partnership. A community gathered at a Hof temple or Hurg, a stone altar, sometimes in a sacred grove where the trees themselves seemed to breathe. Animals were led forward, bowls caught their blood hlout, and a bundle of twigs flicked that warm red onto pillars, people, and carved gods. Ale steamed in the cold air. Mead moved through the crowd like courage. What looks to us like violence looked to them like circulation, a returning of strength so that strength might return. At these rites, the gods of increase were nearest Freya with his golden boar and unabashed symbols of fertility. Freya, whose necklace gleamed like ripe grain. Njordr, who sent fat fish into nets. Toasts rose in a fixed order. The Sigurdrekker for victory, the Brega full for great deeds, the Mini for ancestors. But in spring the toast tilted towards seeds and wombs, toward lambs standing without wobbling, toward ships leaving harbours with a wind that meant trade not shipwreck. And after the public vows, there were the private ones. Old customs never codified, always remembered, sent couples out to fields and groves under the early leaves. There among furrows soft as open palms, they reenacted the promise they had just begged from the gods. Sex in the field was not lewdness, it was analogy. The plough went into the earth, the seed went into the body. If both acts were clean and blessed, the world would thicken with life. As above, so below, a later age would say. The North said it without words. These moments blurred lines modern minds like to draw. Religion, alcohol, sex in the Sagas' tone, these are ingredients, not sins. The cup loosens the fright that winter plants in the chest. The body answers the thaw with heat of its own. Laughter turns to song, song to touch. In some places, the celebration tilted toward orgiastic, not constant, not everywhere, but enough that later churchmen wrote sharply worded complaints about farmhands forgetting their shame at springtime. To the people participating, it was not forgetting. It was remembering what the land asks every year. The choreography had variations. Some communities performed the first ploughing as a rite, a decorated plough, drawn once across the edge of a field, while women circled with baskets of grain, scattering handfuls like blessings. At the Disablo, a feast to the female guardian spirits Dizia, women's presence at the centre of the rite felt not symbolic but operative, as if the household's future were literally being braided by their hands. At Yule Midwinter's hinge, people slaughtered animals for food, and favour made oaths on the Bragarful and lit fires that would carry courage across the blackout months until lambing began. Fertility is not just spring's business. It begins in the dark when hope needs fuel. Listen closely and you can hear the ethnographic echoes. Across old Europe, communities talked to their fields in passionate embodied languages among the Celts. Beltane married fire and flesh, bonfires leaped on the hilltops. Cattle were driven through smoke for health, and lovers slipped into the green where they would not be missed until dawn. In Slavic lands, Kupala night, braided bathing wreaths, leaps over flame, and rumoured forest trysts, a choreography of cleansing and coupling. In the Mediterranean, the Dionysian and Thesmophoria rites entwined wine grain and the sexual license. Rome's Lupercalia ran men through the streets with thongs to strike women lightly, a bizarre but earnest prayer for fertility. The forms differ, the grammar matches. When fields wake, humans imitate their logic of increase. Back in the North, Blot could spill from temple to hall. The same ale that toasted Freya also sanctioned the long night's embrace. The hostess keys bright at her waist decided when benches were cleared, when lamps were lowered, when private doors closed. The principal wife's stewardship even here was political. Pregnancies untimed to marriage could tangle inheritance, so liberty and management had to share a bed. Pleasure was allowed, consequences were tracked. That pairing sacred pragmatism is why these rites endured even after the cross took root. The bishops arrived with sermons against heathen lechery, and still in farmsteads and fishing villages, customs carried on beneath new names. Midsummer bonfires lit for John the Baptist looked suspiciously like old solstice flames. Maypoles rose in Scandinavian valleys, their axial shape and ribbon, dances a polite Christian disguise for a tree that once belonged to Freya. Bridal wreaths were blessed by priests, but woven with old herbs, yarrow for courage, rue for protection, angelica for health that had long served the double duty of medicine and mild contraception. Church councils in the north thundered against women who sing over herbs and men who go out at night to fields for shameful games, which tells us what people continued to do. The calendar itself was repurposed saints' days mapped onto agricultural stages the way new paint seals old wood grain while never quite hiding it. Communities learned to speak two languages at once. Mass in the morning meadow at dusk. Were these celebrations always joyous? Not entirely. They were anxious too. In a climate where one failed harvest could peel a village to the bone, a spring without lambs, a field without germination meant hunger with names. That is why the rites are so embodied. They do not ask politely, they enact. They show the gods what is wanted by doing it. If luck is a shy animal, you lure it with resemblance. It is easy from a modern distance to snicker at the frankness or to condemn the license. But the sagas teach us to read the world on its own terms. A farmer who lets young people couple in the hedgerow after the first plough is not hosting a scandal. He's hedging risk. A family that slaughters at Yule beyond what seems sensible is not wasteful. It is buying courage against a winter that can unmake the living. The rites also performed social maintenance. The feast redistributed meat and mead along lines of kin and need. The dance resowed quarrels. The collective laughter made neighbours again of men who might soon stand on opposite sides of a boundary dispute. Even sexual license, where it appeared, carried its own rules, not with the church's language of sin, but with the community's ledger of don't break what keeps us alive. A fling that insulted a household head or muddied an inheritance was a crime. A tryst between youths of appropriate rank and discretion could pass as the earth's business. So the sacred and the carnal met without shame because they served the same God continuity. You feed the land with blood and the hall with laughter. You stoke bodies and bonfires. You match the swell of rivers with the swell of bellies. You give back so that something will give back to you. When Christianity finally hardened the law and softened some edges, the deep pattern remained. Scandinavian midsummer with flower crowns and lake water, Yule with goats and greenery inside the house, harvest homes with their measured excess. These are not fossils. They are survival's rituals that remember the old equation even when the old gods have new names. The quiet historian's verdict is not that the Vikings were libertines, nor that they were pious in our sense. It is that they were pragmatists with ritual in their bones. They lived close enough to cold and hunger to know that life must be rehearsed as well as worked for, and so when the frost let go, they answered in kind with blood that looked like rain, with cups that felt like courage, with bodies that mirrored fields until the land persuaded by likeness agreed to live again. The law of possession. Possession, rape, property and status. Law is a mirror that never shows the whole face, it reflects what a society is willing to protect. In the Viking world, the reflection is unflinching. The first things law guarded were property, lineage and honour, and only through those did it approach the body. The Old Norse legal imagination divided the world into what could be owned, what could be owed, and what could be avenged. Marriage sat at the knot of all three. A woman did not vanish into her husband's estate. She retained dowry and mourning gift, but her sexual access was nevertheless a matter negotiated between households guaranteed by witnesses and hedged around with the rights of her male guardians. When violence intruded, the law asked not. What did she feel but whose claim was breached? In that calculus, what we call rape was often framed as theft, trespass or damage not against the woman but against the man who stood as her legal protector, father, brother, husband. If a free woman was forced without the consent of her guardian, the offence struck at the household's honour and the clarity of lineage. Compensation and vengeance flowed accordingly. If an enslaved woman was forced, the law usually recorded no crime at all, use of property, not an injury to a person. The brutality here is not disguised. It is structural. A thrall's body did not register on the legal scale. The sagas bear this out with their cool clinical tone. In Greta's saga, when a sexual accusation appears, the language leans toward unauthorized taking rather than bodily violation. The wrong is named as an affront to the husband's rights, not the woman's will. Elsewhere, disputes ignite because the act threatened inheritance, a pregnancy that might plant doubt about paternity, a liaison that humiliated a rival household. Compensation wergild is calculated not according to a universal scale of bodily harm, but according to the woman's status and the social fallout. This is not an absence of ethics, it is a different axis of them. In a world where survival depends on clear lines of descent and dependable alliances, sex becomes a kind of infrastructure. Damaging it is like smashing a bridge. The community treats the loss not as private tragedy but as a public cost. And so the law reaches first for restoration silver to quiet a feud exile, to cool a hot district long before it tries to speak for a woman's pain in her own name. The words themselves carry the worldview. Legal phrases describe a man who takes a woman without permission. Insult formulas that could spark duels include accusing a man of using another's wife. The grammar is active for the male, possessive for the female, and silent toward the female interior. Where modern statutes try to measure consent, Norse custom measured consensus, the assent of the men whose honour and property were implicated. There were limits even here. A husband who beat his wife beyond agreed bounds could face divorce at her instance, and the property penalties stung. A man who forced a highborn woman risked not just fines, but blood feud. Kin could and did kill for such insults. The law could be a weapon in a woman's hand through her male allies. Her voice, though mediated, could move outcomes. But the frame remained harm, travelled through status, not through the universal fact of injury. Christianity's slow arrival did not erase this overnight, but it tilted the lens. Missionaries brought a vocabulary in which sex was freighted with sin and sacrament. Marriage became indissoluble in theory, and sexual transgressions were seen as wounds against God's order. Over generations, law codes in Scandinavian kingdoms began to mix pagan pragmatism with Christian moralism. Ecclesiastical courts asserted jurisdiction over fornication and adultery. Penitentials prescribed penances for coercion, as well as for consensual acts outside marriage. In some later regional codes, one can glimpse the start of a conceptual shift, the recognition, uneven contingent, that forcing a woman could be punished as an offence against her as well as against her kin. But the older arithmetic proved stubborn. Compensation charts still varied by rank. Proof still hinged on witnesses and the choreography of public declaration. A woman who cried wrong had to do so properly, naming the place, the time, the assailant, tearing her clothes at the door, calling neighbours so that her claim entered the community's memory as law. Fail the ritual, and even truth could be discounted. What of adultery? Here too, the Norse treated sex as a species of trespass. A husband who caught an adulterer with his wife could kill him with limited penalty. A wife who strayed risked divorce and loss of property. Yet the same society tolerated a husband's concubines. The double standard is not hidden, it is codified. Inheritance drove the law. A man's recognised children needed unambiguous placement in the lineage tree. The wife's fidelity guarded that tree. The husband's pleasure garnered his reputation but did not endanger the trunk unless his indulgence inflamed feuds within the hall. We recoil at these asymmetries as we should, but the quiet historians ask for one more step to read the texts on their own terms before we pass judgment from ours. Moral relativism is not moral indifference. It is the discipline of precision. To say rape was treated as property damage in Norse law is not to excuse it. It is to diagnose the way power and protection were mapped. A map can be accurate and unjust at once. The cost of that map is written in the margins: women whose bodies became the medium of men's quarrels, enslaved women whose pain registered nowhere at all, children whose paternity was argued like a boundary stone in a fog. And yet within the same system we also see female leverage, the wife who divorces a violent husband and keeps her dowry, the widow who refuses a match and is heeded because her property strengthens the district, the daughter whose betrothal reroutes a feud into fellowship. Law is never only a cage, and for the shrewd it is also a key. As Christianity deepened, sermons thundered against fornication, while farmsteads quietly maintained the practical customs that kept households functioning, control of fertility discretion, before gossip settlements over sins. For centuries the two logics coexisted, the priest's confessional and the lawman's compensation board, the rhetoric of purity and the reality of peacekeeping. To read these sources is to feel the friction of two moral climates overlapping. The old climate measured injury by status and consequence. The new tried to measure it by intention and consent, though it too often fell back on rank and reputation when cases reached court. We have not entirely escaped those shadows ourselves. Our own laws still wobble between the body's testimony and the community's comfort, between what can be proved and what is merely known. So let the verdict here be double. The Norse world offered women remarkable freedoms in property and divorce. It also erased them at the precise moment when they most needed the law's protection. It treated sexual injury as a crack in a household's architecture, not as a wound in a person. That is a truth to acknowledge without flinching. And then, having acknowledged, we can allow a second recognition that every legal order, ours included, chooses what it is willing to see. The sagas with their spare sentences do not teach us how to feel, they teach us how carefully we must look. 1,000 years from now, readers may trace our blind spots with the same mixture of shock and comprehension. The mirror of law will reflect their faces, not ours, and they will judge us by what we chose to protect. Invisible women, female homosexuality and silence. Sometimes history shouts, more often it edits. In the Viking record, the loudest absence is not gods or kings, but women loving women. The sagas name passions that break families' feuds, stoked by jealousy, men taunted with the language of ergi, and yet when we look for women's desire turned toward women, the page goes vague. Not forbidden, not celebrated, mostly ignored. That silence has been misread as tolerance. It is not. It is indifference, a patriarchy so thoroughly arranged around men's honour and lineages that pleasure without a man scarcely counts as an event. The legal machinery that whirred over male sexuality, duels over slender fines for trespass, boasted conquests. The terror of passivity was designed to protect status and seed. Women's bodies enter that machine when reproduction or property is at stake. Otherwise, the gears do not turn. What would it take to be visible? In Norse society, visibility follows consequence. Acts that threatened inheritance or insulted a man triggered law and saga. 2 women in a dairy shed, 2 women in a loft after the hall sleeps. If no lineage blurs, no bride price wobbles, no feud ignites, the community's archive remains shut. Pleasure not connected to paternity is treated as non-news. This is not to say such love did not exist. Every society that leaves diaries unwritten and bedrooms unrecorded still has human beings who find each other in the dark. The archaeological ground is mute on this bones do not hold the shape of affection, and the texts look away because their authors looked. Where men's business lay, war trade, inheritance, insult. Within that aperture, even extraordinary women appear mostly in roles that mirror men's concerns. Wives who negotiate widows, who hold property, seeresses, who anchor ritual. Desire between women falls between columns in the ledger. We can feel that omission when the sagas do brush women against women. There are moments of intimacy, shared beds for warmth on journeys, embraces in grief, the fierce loyalty of fosterage and milk kinship. The prose is chaste because its purpose is not to record arousal, but his duty. To read tenderness there and wonder if it sometimes flowered beyond duty is natural. To insist the texts must say so is to forget what the texts are, documents of a public world arranged around male memory. The law mirrors the literature. Where male-male sex could explode into the social crime of ergi, female-female sex rarely reaches the threshold of mention. Not because it is accepted, but because it does not obviously threaten men's interests. A wife pregnant by another woman is an impossibility in the logic of her inheritance. Therefore, the law trained to guard borders of property and paternity has no obvious foothold. What is not a risk to the tree of kin may not be a crime to the court. Cross-cultural echoes deepen the pattern. In classical Athens, male homoerotic relations are argued, idealized, and regulated in public discourse. Women's same-sex love, Sappho aside, glides under the record, not sanctified, not prosecuted, simply unprioritized by men who write. In Rome, moralists police the penetrative act. Female-female sex appears as satire or rumour, not statute. In medieval canon law, treatises swell with anxiety over sodomy among men, while female acts are acknowledged only intermittently, and often folded into the broad sin of luxury or lust without the granular vocabulary reserved for male conduct. In Islamic jurisprudence, male liwat is elaborately described and legally encoded. Female sihak tribadism is referenced, but generally punished less severely, or treated as a lesser moral wrong again, not because it is cherished, but because it does not imperil paternal certainty. Across these worlds, the axis is constant where patriarchy calculates, it records. Psychologically, invisibility cuts two ways. For women who felt desire for women, silence could be cover a way to live without provoking the legal and lethal responses reserved for men. A glance lasts longer when no one is trained to police it. A spinning bench can be a sanctuary. The textile room filled with the clack of looms and the drift of wool leaves, hands busy and eyes free. Within that bustle, companionship could ripen into something deeper with less danger of scandal because no one believed there was scandal to find. But what protects also erases. Without recognition, there is no language, no shared names, no oaths to exchange, no rites to bless. Love must survive without a script. There is another cost. When a society refuses to map a desire, it cannot imagine its ethics. The Vikings, practical to the end, developed moral grammars for the passions they noticed: discretion to avoid inheritance tangles, compensation to heal trespass, divorce to end harm. For women-loving women, there is no recorded grammar because the community declines to name the relation. That leaves private pairs to invent rules in a vacuum: how to manage jealousy when husbands are chosen for them, how to arrange meetings without threatening their household's fabric, how to grieve a love without funerary rites or saga lines to hold it. The wound here is not punishment, it is unacknowledgedness. We can carefully read sideways. Consider the Desir rites, where female spirits of fate receive offerings and the social power of women gathers around a sacred centre. Consider the Volure, whose authority, however liminal, makes men hush. Consider the fosterage ties and household management that put women in sustained proximity, trusting each other with the stores, keys, and children. Environments of intense same-sex cooperation are fertile ground for attachments everywhere we can see history clearly. It is reasonable to infer they sometimes were here, but to say it must have happened is not to say it was legible to the culture. The point is the disconnect a likely human reality that the record cannot or will not translate. If we look for resistance in the texts, we find it mostly through absence with edges jokes that do not land because a category is missing. Insults that can only imagine women as passive objects, never as subjects of desire. Domestic scenes where female solidarity blocks a husband's aim with the quiet force of practiced alliance. It is telling that the harshest word for a man, Arga, depends on feminization as degradation. A culture that relies on that logic is ill-equipped to describe women's desire without folding it into men's, either as a tale of rivalries over a male body or as an exoticized spectacle for male amusement. Neither yields what we are hunting women as protagonists of their own longing, and yet the living do not wait for permission to feel. Somewhere under a turf roof, two women who shared chores shared also a bed on a journey, and the warmth did not let go. Somewhere a widow with property and a young woman in her household braided a partnership that looked to neighbours like competent management and to themselves like home. Somewhere a girl promised to a distant farmer learned to carry a grief that had no ritual, shaping her resilience in chambers history did not light. Quiet historians do not fix silence with fantasies. We mark its contours. We say the Viking world built its archives around male honour and reproduction. Within that architecture, women's same-sex love was not legible to the courts and only rarely to the stories. The result is not proof of absence, but proof of priority. What a culture counts, it counts in public. What it will not count, it leaves in the dark. The verdict is sober. Norse society could grant women property rights, divorce, and a measure of sexual autonomy unseen elsewhere and still erase their pleasure when it did not serve men's genealogies. That paradox is not uniquely Scandinavian. It is common wherever patriarchy is both competent and narrow efficient at order, incurious about the forms of joy that order does not require. If there is a lesson to carry forward, it is not that the past was heartless and we are enlightened. It is that archives are machines of selection, and every selection breeds ghosts. To honour those ghosts, we approach the record with two truths in our hands: that silence is a kind of violence, and that within silence people still built lives. The loom clacks, the keys ring, the hall roars with men's boasts, and somewhere very near that noise women lean close the space between them, charged with a meaning the law will never name: Valkyries and the fear of female power. They enter the poem like a weather front, helms bright as frostmail that drinks the dawn horses' manes streaming like surf. Valkyrie Odin's choosers of the slain ride the hinge between battle and afterlife, gathering the worthy steering spears, deciding which names will be remembered. The skalds call them swan maidens, shield bearers, Teir's women whose glance can tilt a field of men. Their beauty is an instrument, their autonomy a problem the story must solve. In myth, the solution is domestication by narration. Many Valkyries begin as untouchable agents of fate and end in kitchens or bedchambers, captured by cleverness or compelled by a trick. A warrior spies 3 swan maidens bathing, steals a cloak of feathers, and the one stranded without her wings becomes his wife at the price of her presence paid in sands. Or consider Brynhildr, the most famous of Valkyrie, who disobeys Odin, pricking the wrong king with sleep. For her willfulness, she's condemned to mortal life behind a wall of flames until a hero identifies her, wakes her, and later, through deceit and political necessity, hands her to a man she did not choose. The sagas give her intelligence, prophecy, and Ciceronian dignity. Then they clip her with marriage, turning a sovereign chooser of the slain into a pawn in a feud. Her fury burns a hall and a lineage, and the poets shake their heads as if to say, "See what happens when a woman refuses the harness." These plots are not neutral. They are arguments disguised as wonder women with weapons belong to gods and songs, not to the logistics of daily power. When they enter the world of men, they must be translated into brides, into betrayals, into tragedies that teach obedience. Myth protects the social order by praising the dangerous and then binding it with rings. And yet the ground tells a less accommodating story. In Birka, the Viking Age trading hub on Björka Island in Sweden, archaeologists long ago opened a warrior's grave. BJ one stocked with a full panoply, sword axe, spear, arrows, 2 shields, 2 horses, and a set of gaming pieces, and a board that many take as the sign of an officer's command in the wargame of real battles. For over a century, the skeleton slotted neatly into expectation a decorated male. Then a new line of evidence spoke. DNA analysis identified the buried warrior as biologically female. The grave goods did not rearrange themselves. They remained the gear of a high-status fighting life. The announcement set teeth on edge. Some argued the equipment could be symbolic or heirloom. Others suggested the bones might be mixed. But the context carefully placed weapons, tactical gaming counters, riding gear makes ritual tokenism a thin answer. The more conservative conclusion is still startling enough. At least one woman in Viking society was buried with the material language of a frontline professional, and she was honoured that way by those who knew her. Whether she fought, often commanded, or embodied a lineage's military identity is a debate that keeps the journals warm. The mound itself keeps the simpler testimony someone thought her a warrior and wrote it in iron horn and horse. Birka is not alone in its whisper. Scattered finds across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic, graves with weapons and female bodies, graves with riding gear, graves with healers' kits alongside knives paint a nuanced picture. Not a world of Amazon armies, but a society with porous edges, where exceptional women took up exceptional roles and were sometimes remembered for it. The sagas too preserve figures like Herva, who dons armour to demand her inheritance from a barrow ghost, and Order Unn, who though not a fighter commands with the steel calm that the myths pretend only men can wield. The literary Valkyrie may be a storm on horseback. The historical woman could be a landholder who signs a widow who hires men a rider, whose grave makes strangers blink. Why then does myth so often punish the independent woman with domestication or doom? Because the society that birthed those songs both admired and feared female power. It needed women to anchor household stitched sails, make law through marriage, and sometimes stand in a chieftain's stead. But it also needed hierarchy to feel natural. A woman who kills, commands, or refuses a match threatens the map. She redraws lines without asking. The poems respond the way authority always does to anomalies, praise her radiance, then put her in a story where her edges are sanded off. Notice how the scripts work. The Swan Maiden tale literalizes the theft of agency. Take the cloak, take the woman. The Sleepthorn and Fire Hedge around Brynhilde stage, a kind of immobilization. The powerful woman is frozen and must be awakened by a man, after which her choices are rooted through his. Even the epithet virginal warrior carries the seed of containment. She is safe to adore as long as she is sexually unavailable. Once she loves on her own terms, the plot cracks her like ice. Real life offered subtler negotiations. A woman with keys and land could resist marriage, select partners, or manage lovers with pragmatic discretion. But those freedoms were domestic and economic, not celebratory of female violence. When women stepped onto the battlefield or into the council of war, their presence rattled the code that made male agency the currency of honor. So the culture externalized its anxiety, projecting the female fighter into the other world, rendering her as a supernatural emissary who obeys a god not herself. That way men could admire the image without reworking the law. The Burqa burial presses on that comfort. It says sometimes the image leaked. Sometimes a woman's life outpaced her society's categories, and the community honoured the fact afterward, when the risks of accommodating her were over. In death they allowed what life had complicated, the inscription of a female name in a masculine script. The earth becomes braver than the hall. There is a quiet generosity in reading these signs without forcing them. We do not need to turn the Viking world into a matriarchy in waiting to honour the few who wore swords, nor must we dismiss the myths as simple propaganda. They are negotiations, poetic ways to keep order while admitting that power does not always flow through the expected vessel. Each Valkyrie riding out of the clouds is a thought experiment about female agency, thrilling at a safe distance, terrifying up close, and so the verdict is measured. The Norse imagined women who chose the slain and bent battles like reeds, then they tried to marry them off. The ground occasionally returns the favour. It shows us a woman who lived as the poem insists she shouldn't, and it refuses to marry her off in memory. Between those two truths, song and soil, we glimpse a society arguing with itself about what women may be. What remains after the horses fade and the mound settles is the lesson the Valkyries were made to carry, and the Burqa dead insists on power is not well kept by one gender. Cultures that fear it in women build myths to cage it. Cultures that admit it must redraw their maps. The Vikings did both, sang the cage, dug the grave, and left us enough to hear the iron ringing under the rhyme. When the cross arrived, the Christian turn. Conversion did not sweep the north like a storm. It arrived like winter, early in some valleys, late in others, patchy, persistent, changing the colour of the ground long before it froze it. Where blot once hummed and wedding keys rang without fear of priests, new words began to take root: sin, purity, sacrament. The old arithmetic order over chastity, lineage over doctrine met a rival grammar that judged bodies by intention and eternity. For centuries the two spoke over each other in the halls, at the law thing and the bed. Kings noticed the usefulness first. A faith that taught one God, one truth, one king was a tool as sharp as any sword. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth raised a stone at Jelling and boasted he had made the Danes Christian. In Norway, Olafur Tryggvason and later Olafur Haraldsson St. Olaf drove baptisms with a mixture of persuasion and steel. In Sweden, Olof Skutkonung coined money with crosses and ceded space to bishops. The church brought what chieftain politics lacked: bishops who could write law that could be copied and carried courts that reached beyond kin. With catechism came cadastra, tithes, parishes, calendars, and a pulpit that could preach obedience as heaven's will. There was a domestic bargain hiding in that statecraft. The church promised monogamy, indissoluble marriage, and the sanctification of the marriage bed tools that centralized household order under Christian law. Kings who wanted fewer feuds and clearer inheritance lines embraced reforms that narrowed sexual options. A single legitimate wife meant a cleaner succession. A banned blot meant fewer rival centres of loyalty. Clerical celibacy prevented sons of priests from carving fiefdoms out of parishes. Politics wore vestments and called itself salvation. The shift was conspicuous among the elite. Saga tradition remembers Haraldr Haarfagri. Harald Fairhair, the would-be unifier of Norway late 9th to early 10th century, keeping many wives and concubines, his household a map of alliances. That was the old way of virility as statecraft. But 2 centuries later, royal households were being rebuilt in the church's image. Kings still strayed, desire did not learn Latin. Yet the permissible shape of kingship narrowed, and with it the choices available to everyone who copied courtly fashion. Christian law redrew the borders of marriage first. What had been a clan contract public dissolvable for practical reasons became a sacrament. Consent, the church insisted, must be mutual and interior bride and groom, saying, "I will before God" mattered more than the ale feast and the sword in the beam. In principle, this raised a woman's moral voice. In practice, guardians still negotiated matches, and priests blessed what families arranged. But the seed of a new idea was planted. A woman had a soul that could consent and that mattered even against her father's ledger. The price was carved elsewhere. Divorce once a doorway a woman could step through with witnesses and reasons was barred. Annulment crept in through technicalities, kinship, too close vows improperly made, but the quick practical endings that had kept the North flexible froze into lifelong binds. A wife with a violent husband now had penance. She did not automatically have property and exit. The mourning gift remained on the books, dowry persisted, and Scandinavian custom continued to respect women's inheritance more than many Christian lands. But the easy reboot of a household, the right to say no more at the threshold, slipped from women's hands into the chanceries. Sin relabelled acts that had once been management. Premarital sex moved from danger if indiscreet to fornication. Adultery, already a property insult, became a wound against a sacrament. Cedar, the female-coded magic that asked a person to receive, slid under the widening canopy of witchcraft. The feasts that had braided ale blood and coupling were pruned back. Yule kept its greenery, but its gods were renamed. Spring rites survived as village merriment with a crucifix looking on. The church did not end the pragmatism of the North so much as veil it, turning old habits into local abuses tolerated when bishops were far condemned, when bishops were near. Men felt the turn in their boasts. To take multiple wives and scatter acknowledged children across the fjords had once proven might. Now it threatened excommunication, a penalty as political as it was spiritual. Clergy brought penitentials that indexed acts to penances, fasts, pilgrimages, alms, transforming the body's private history into the church's accounting. The sword still mattered, but so did the confessional, a new room, where power bent its head and found itself catalogued. For women, the ledger mixed loss and leverage. The church's emphasis on consent and the sanctity of marriage could shield a bride from forced remarriage and sanctify her no at the altar, at least in theory. The cult of the Virgin Mary elevated an ideal of womanhood that was pious, pure, and powerful in Mater Crucis intercession, yet it also narrowed the imagination of female virtue to chastity and obedience. The keys at a wife's belt still rattled property rights, did not vanish overnight, and in Icelandic and Norwegian law women continued to inherit and to speak at court. But the moral script around those keys changed. Authority was to be exercised with modesty. Sexuality was to be contained within vows that would not break. The law books caught the hinge in their pages. Christian sections of Gragas in Iceland and the Gulathing and Frostathing laws in Norway grafted church norms onto local practice, outlawing pagan sacrifices, fining illicit unions, punishing clerics who married, prescribing Sunday rest and tithes. Where the old codes cared about witnesses, the new ones cared about priests. Where the old codes measured damage in silver, the new ones measured it also in sin, a dual economy that could conflict or cooperate depending on who sat in judgment. Resistance was as northern as snow. In the first Christian generations, polygyny and concubinage lingered at the edges, especially in frontier districts and among magnates who could afford defiance. Baptized on Sunday, bride beds on Monday, muttered more than one monk. Even royal converts were inconsistent. But the power of baptismal politics alliances with emperors trade with Christian markets' literacy that fixed charters slowly outweighed the tastes of old men. A king who wanted the church's blessing needed the church's household one queen legitimate heirs, a court that looked like a sermon. The makeover of gender roles rode in with the catechism. Male passivity, already a terror in Norse honor codes, found fresh condemnation in clerical rhetoric that feminized vice and praised a kind of sanctified self-control. Female sexual autonomy, once protected by divorce and property, was reinterpreted through obedience and chastity. Yet threads of the old tapestry persisted. Widows continued to manage estates. Merchant scales still surface in women's graves well into the Christian centuries. Abbesses in time would govern lands with a calm that echoed the old Husfreyja under a new Latin name. And so the collision did not end in wreckage so much as lamination. Two logics pressed together until they looked like one. A village might keep saints' days that trace the rhythm of sowing and lambing. A bride might still wear herbs whose uses grandmothers would not name in the priest's hearing. A king might confess on Saturday and negotiate a mistress on Tuesday, trusting in the elasticity of both flesh and absolution. The public words shifted. The private calculations often stayed the same. What changed most durably was the story people told about their bodies. The old story measured acts by outcome. Did this keep the household whole? Did this seed the field? The new story measured them by intention. Did you will impurity? Did your thoughts offend a God who sees them? Between those stories lay 1,000 negotiations, some tender, some cruel. Women who once stood in doorways to declare divorce now stood in naves promising forever. Men whose honour had depended on never being acted upon learned to bow to hands on their heads in absolution. The quiet historian's verdict is not that one age was pure and the other free. It is that power, kingship, priesthood, patriarchy uses the grammar available. In the pagan centuries, the grammar was blood witness and feast. In the Christian centuries, it was sermon, charter, and sin. The same will to organise people around a centre moved through both. Harold Fairhair's cluster of wives showed a chieftain's reach. A later king's single sanctified queen showed a monarch's convergence with Rome. Each arrangement served a politics of control, and yet between law and sermon people kept living. Husbands and wives bargained beneath icons where gods had once hung in carved wood. On the coast, a fisherman's daughter heard about Mary and still tied Angelica at her belt in spring. Under vaulted roofs a queen prayed, then counted rents with the steadiness of any woman who ever wore keys. The cross did not silence the Old North at once. It changed the pitch, and in that lowered, lasting tone we can still hear the negotiation that made a civilization desire, learning new steps to an ancient song about order, memory, and who gets to say what a life must look like. The long echo. What survived, and what died? Conversion layered a new grammar over the North, but it did not erase every old sentence. Some lines were sanded down, others kept showing through the paint whenever the light struck slantwise. If we listen for the long echo of Viking sexual culture beneath the centuries of Christianity, we hear three recurring notes: ease of exit, women's economic standing, and a habit of negotiation between the sexes sounding on and off, sometimes clearly, sometimes through walls. Begin with what did loudest. The theatrical freedoms of the pagan age polygyny among elites, ritual fertility revels in ploughed fields. Public codes that measured honour by sexual dominance could not live unchanged inside a sacramental order. Church courts hardened, marriage condemned concubinage, stylized chastity. The vocabulary of Irgi bled into sermons about unnatural vice, and the casual acceptance of using enslaved women as sexual property became harder to say aloud as Christian rhetoric spread even where practice lagged. The old world's pragmatism without guilt was thinned by guilt with new rules. And yet much survived not as open defiance, but as custom that kept working. Divorce the door that once swung easily did not slam shut everywhere at once. Formal indissolubility became law. Practical separations, annulments, and locally recognized partings continued. Scandinavian law books compiled in the Christian centuries still made room for untying knots by other names, households separating for cause spouses living apart from bed and board, property being redistributed under the eyes of kin and lawmen. The old idea that marriage was a contract between families built to serve peace and provision remained underneath the sacrament like a brace inside a wall. In frontier places and among common folk endings, could still be managed, documented by witnesses, and the slow consent of neighbours even if the bishop's Latin disapproved. Women's property rights, so characteristic of the Viking North, proved stubborn. Dowry remained a woman's asset, the mourning gift continued in various guises, widows kept authority over estates, daughters inherited often at fractional shares that still compared favourably to much of medieval Europe. Runestones from the Christian period continue to name women as commissioners and donors, and legal records show them suing, witnessing, lending and guarding family land with competence that would have been unremarkable to a 10th century husfreyja. Keys did not fall silent because bells rang, they merely clinked under a new blessing. Relative gender negotiation also persisted. The domestic duet, his public risk match to her management of resources, fosterage and hospitality survived conversion because it was structural, not ideological. The hall still needed provisioning, winter still punished error, and a household's reputation still depended on the wife's judgment at the chest and threshold. Christian virtue asked her to be modest. The climate demanded she be effective. In many places she was both. Across the full medieval arc, then, we see a laminated culture Christian ideals on top Norse pragmatics beneath the two, sometimes fusing, sometimes flexing against each other. From that laminate later Scandinavia drew habits that outsiders mistook for pagan nostalgia, but that were really continuities of competence. A peasant society of freeholders, relatively light feudalisation, and a long tradition of women handling assets meant that when early modern and modern reforms arrived, Lutheran literacy drives that taught girls to read catechism, urban trade that monetized household production, 19th century legal revisions, there was already a muscle memory for female participation in the public economy. Here is where myth presses its face to the glass. Modern Nordic egalitarianism, high female labour participation, robust parental leave, normalised cohabitation, legalised same-sex marriage, sex education frankness, looks from a distance like a straight line back to Viking freedoms. Many would love that romance. The truth is both richer and humbler. Yes, echoes carry. The recognition of women's capacity to own, manage and speak in economic matters is ancient in the North and reappears in later centuries with relatively less friction than elsewhere. The cultural preference for order over purity solving problems practically before moralizing them reappears in modern policies that approach sexuality through health, education and consent, rather than shame. The habit of negotiation households as micropolities where authority is bargained, rather than decreed, feels old because it is. But historians warn against a myth of continuity that makes modern Scandinavia a warmed-over longhouse. Today's egalitarianism owes at least as much to Lutheran universal literacy women, reading, signing, counting agrarian independence, a strong class of free farmers, rather than a manor-bound peasantry, industrial and welfare state reforms, 20th century legislation on marriage inheritance, work and childcare, and the moral catastrophes of 2 world wars that reconfigured European expectations about the state's role in private life. To say Viking women had rights, therefore Nordic gender equality, is a pretty sentence with missing clauses. Scholars divide roughly into continuists and constructivists. The continuists trace threads from the sagas through medieval law to modern custom women, commissioning stones, signing parish registers, inheriting farms, running coastal trade while men were at sea, arguing that a deep grammar of practical equality bridged the centuries even as theology changed. The constructivists counter that most such threads are retrospective embroidery, that Christian patriarchy meaningfully constricted women's autonomy, that when we find a later freedom we project it backward, that modern Nordic progress is a modern construction indebted to schooling, socialism and statute more than to memory. Between them moves a third view, the one the ground itself seems to prefer, which says both. Cultural substrates matter. So do reinventions. The long echo makes certain reforms easier to hear. The new music still has to be written. Listen finally to what did not survive in any valorized way, the sexual terror of passivity that made ergi a social death, the normalization of sexualized humiliation as a weapon, the easy folding of enslaved women's bodies into a man's rights. Christianity did not cure these. Modern law and ethics, centuries of debate about consent, personhood and equality curbed them. Where the Old North hands us something worth keeping, women's property, leverage realist sex ethics that prized outcomes over posturing, we may take it. Where it hands us harm, we do not varnish it with romance. And yet the cadence of the past keeps time beneath the present. Consider a modern Scandinavian kitchen, shared childcare fathers, on parental leave mothers signing, Mortgages, children taught frank, age-appropriate sex education in school, none of that is Viking. All of it rhymes with the older conviction that households function when everyone acts that survival is a joint project, that dignity is a practical good. The old key at the belt has become a code to the bank app. The ledger is digital, the law is kinder about endings, but the gesture competence as love is recognisable. So what survived the scaffolding of a domestic politics that trusted women with resources? A suspicion of purity rules that produce chaos instead of order? An esteem for cleverness alongside courage? What died? The ritual publicness of the body, the polygamous theatre of rule, the legal non-personhood of those at the bottom. The quiet historian's verdict is simple. The Viking Age is not a blueprint for the present. It is a basement stone cold load-bearing. Above it, generations added floors, churches, schools, parliaments, clinics. When the house creaks in a storm, you can still feel the old foundation under your feet. To honour it is not to move back into it. It is to recognise which stones carry weight and which we were right to leave under the earth. The quiet verdict of history. The torches are almost gone. You can hear them though, the last fat spitting the faint pop as a knot in the wood releases its breath. In that soft dark after the noise of raids and trials and weddings and law things, the North is easier to hear. It does not roar, it explains itself if we let it. We came here chasing answers about bodies who held them, who used them, who owned the laws that named their movements. We found no simple ledger of saints and sinners. We found a civilization that treated sex as infrastructure, part bridge, part boundary, part tool for holding a hard world together. We found tenderness and terror braided so closely that our own categories snapped when we tried to comb them. What looks barbaric from our hill, the bedding witnesses, the use of slaves, the jeers that turned a word into a wound, was from theirs a set of devices for keeping names clean and fields inherited. What looks progressive from our window women's property, easy divorce, a calm acceptance that desire must be managed rather than denied, was from theirs not enlightenment but utility. If the roof leaks, patch it. If a match fails, end it. If a daughter can strengthen the farm, give her the keys and do not ask the sky's permission. History refuses to be flattered by our surprise. It has seen many ages call themselves the present tense of truth. The Vikings called their customs natural because they worked. We call ours ethical because we prefer them. Both claims, if held too tightly, are vanity. The archive's gift is not affirmation but friction, the drag that keeps us from lifting off into the easy air of moral self-congratulation. We learned a hard grammar here. Agency mattered more than purity. Status could make a hurt visible or make it disappear. Witness was a form of law. Silence was too. We watched women use the rules so that the rules would not use them. We watched men perform courage in public and pay for it in private. We watched enslaved women walk a wire so narrow that survival itself became a strategy. We listened to magic sound like scandal and wisdom at once. We saw the cross arrive not to erase but to overlay, and the old sentences keep showing through when the light was right. And then we stepped back. The picture changed. From a distance, every age turns allegory. The Viking Hall becomes a mirror room where we meet ourselves under different lanterns. We see how quickly a culture can turn desire into doctrine, how easily a household problem grows into a theology, how neatly a king can call control salvation. We see the cruel arithmetic of ranking harm by rank. We also see the stubborn decency of people making a life a widow who counts rents with care, a husband who carries a child through snow, a thrall who teaches her son the words that will lift him one rung higher than she could stand. And the question the North keeps asking is not, were they good? It is, how did their world make sense to them? When we answer that honestly, judgment does not vanish, it deepens. It learns to hold two truths at once, that a society can be ingenious and unjust, that a custom can be both protective and cruel, that what kept a family warm often asked someone else to stand in the cold. From that double knowing humility begins, not the low bow of false equivalence, but the straight-backed admission that moral universals are often local successes dressed in timeless clothes. We still convert preferences into principles. We still mistake what helps us for what should bind the earth. We still inherit laws that started life as bargains and forget the bargaining. The Viking past is not a relic that can scold us into goodness. It is a landscape that trains the eye notice who is counted notice, who is named notice where the keys hang. Notice what the law protects first. There is a reason the sagas are spare. They do not tell us what to feel, They tell us what happened and let the room decide the rest. That restraint is a kind of ethic. It asks us to supply the mercy. It forces us to recognize that every clean sentence about the past has been washed in water that someone carried. So what is the quiet verdict? Not absolution, not condemnation, instruction. The North teaches that every civilization translates desire into law, weddings into contracts, jealousy into fines, seduction into strategy, reproduction into policy. It shows how those translations keep order and how they generate ghosts, people whose bodies bear the weight of compromises, struck in rooms they were not allowed to enter. It reminds us that law is not a sky. It is a syntax changed by who speaks it, bent by who can afford to. It teaches too that reform is seldom a clean break. The cross did not shatter the longhouse, it furnished it differently. The old gods did not vanish. Their questions about luck exchange and the price of knowledge smuggled themselves into new liturgies. In our time, new words, consent, equality, autonomy, seek to do what mead and witnesses once did stabilize, promise, apportion, risk, rescue dignity from the hands of chance. We should be proud of those words. We should not pretend they are final. Because the record we have built will one day be someone else's noise. Our rituals will look like theatre. Our policies will look like prayers. Our blind spots will be obvious to people who have not yet been born. And if we have learned anything from the Viking Hall, it is that pride ages badly, while remembrance, accurate, tender, unsparing, keeps the human contract from fraying. So we leave the North as we found it, not with a verdict hammered in iron, but with an invitation carved in wood. Question the universals, test the usefulness of your virtue. Protect the bodies that the law forgets. When you inherit a rule, ask whose story made it necessary and whose silence keeps it intact. And when you admire the past for its bravery or rebuke it for its brutality, remember that you are measuring with tools the past did not know, tools someone handed you because they too outgrew an older faith in what felt natural. The torches finally sputter out. The hall re-enters the dark that once held it. But our eyes used now to the low light keep seeing a ring of keys, a staff capped with iron, a sword in a beam, a whisper at a door, a name that was almost erased and wasn't. To remember is not to excuse. It is to hold a mirror steady while the faces change. It is to admit that we are always translating desire into law, love, into lineage, harm, into remedy, and to do that work with more care than those before us because they have lent us their mistakes. Remembrance is humility in action, a promise that when the next civilization asks who we were, there will be fewer ghosts in the margins and more names in the light. What the Vikings still teach us about desire, power, and making a life. Strip away the horned helmets and thunder, and the Viking world leaves us with a subtler inheritance, a manual for how societies translate desire into law, and how people carve dignity from whatever rules they're given. Their codes are often brutal, sometimes astonishingly flexible, always pragmatic. Precisely because they are not our values, they sharpen our sight. Here are the lessons that endure. 1. Prefer order to posturing. The Norse measured sex less by purity than by consequences. Did this stabilize a household, harvest a lineage? We can keep the moral gains we've made, consent, equality, autonomy, while borrowing their focus on outcomes. In life and work, judgment that improves real conditions beats judgment that merely sounds righteous. 2. Build systems that assume human nature, not deny it. Preachers tried to outlaw desire. Farmers managed it. Good policy works like a well-run longhouse. It channels predictable behavior towards safer ends. Education, access to healthcare, transparent rules instead of pretending people will stop being people. 3. Write contracts you can exit with dignity. Norse divorce recognized that some bonds break and gave both parties a lawful door. Design your commitments, jobs, partnerships, projects with humane off-ramps. Endings handled well preserve reputation and future cooperation. 4. Put resources in the hands of competent stewards. Keys at the belt signaled who kept a household alive. Empower the people, often women, who actually run the engine room. In families and teams, authority should follow ability, not habit. 4. Honor agency, refuse humiliation. Viking masculinity's terror of passivity produced cruelties that still echo wherever shame is used as control. The counter lesson is clear: build cultures where no one has to degrade another to prove worth. Replace status games with standards, shared goals, measurable craft, mutual respect. Remember, law is a syntax, not the sky. Norse codes protected what they cared about property and lineage. Our laws should make visible what we care about now: Bodies consent equal protection. Revisit rules regularly. Ask whose story they serve and whose silence they require. 7. Practice pragmatic compassion. The sagas rarely sermonize, they describe. That restraint invites us to supply the mercy. When judging others and ourselves, look first for constraints and incentives. People adapt to stay alive. Start from that truth, then ask how to widen their choices. 8. Keep ritual but make it kinder. Blot and bedding were technologies of cohesion. We need rituals too. Onboarding, family meals, weekly retros that bind us without coercion. Tradition is worth keeping when it nourishes. Retire it when it harms. 9. Beware pretty myths of continuity. Not every good modern thing is Viking. Give credit to reforms literacy, law, public health that made life gentler. Admiring the past is safer when paired with gratitude for progress. 10. Lead with humility. Every age mistakes its preferences for universals. The Vikings did. We do. Humility means testing values against results, listening to those the law forgets and correcting course while it still matters. In sum, organize for reality, protect agency, design, merciful exits, empower competence, and keep updating the rules. That is how a life like a longhouse stays warm through a long winter.